Good afternoon. Welcome to our annual Department of Sociology and Anthropology Ivan Fahs Memorial Symposium, which typically consists of a chapel message, which we heard this morning from Dr. Edwards, and then a lecture in the afternoon or evening. Each year, we endeavor to invite a sociologist or anthropologist who embodies Dr. Fahs' legacy of Christian scholarship, working with students, and community activity. Ivan combined sociology and action. I was reminded of this looking at a short biography of him again just recently. In November 2002, Dr. Fahs received Illinois' Studs Terkel Humanitarian Service Award for his work on behalf of the homeless, which included working in the 1990s with the city of Wheaton's Task Force on Homelessness. And we are glad to have Joyce Fahs with us here this afternoon in front, and granddaughter as well. For an introduction of this afternoon's speaker, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Amy Reynolds.
Hello, good afternoon. So, as you can see, today we're welcoming Korie Little-Edwards, who's an associate professor of sociology at Ohio State University. She's the author or co-author of 3 books, in addition to 15 academic articles that deal largely with issues of religion and race. And she was awarded a large grant from the Lilly Foundation for leading the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project, which she'll be talking about a little bit today, which uses multi-methods of interviews, focus groups, and surveys to look at the religious leadership of racially and ethnically diverse congregations. Some of her recent articles have focused on questions of power and identity in racially diverse congregations, as well as speaking to methodological discussions around this type of research. As a recognized expert in this field, Dr. Edwards recently finished serving as the president for the Society of the Scientific Study of Religion, which is a community of social scientists engaged with questions of religion and religion in public life. But as we talk today about the spirit of Ivan Fahs, as Dr. Miller was discussing, we really want to celebrate the way her scholarship is connected with activism. And as I was re-looking over the work she's done, I think you see this in many areas of her life, the way this scholarship is connected with engagement and activism. So for example, at her university, she's currently chairing efforts around diversity and inclusion, and she served in the faculty senate or governing body. She speaks and writes about her scholarship in a number of public settings. You may have heard her a couple years ago on Religion and Ethics News Weekly on PBS or public radio, or read about her research in the Washington Post. Towards the faith community, she's been particularly active on these issues of religion and race and talking at conferences. And so just some of those that she's spoken at recently would be the Just Gospel, Mosaics, Better Together, Converge 214, and even this morning in the Wheaton College Chapel. So I'm just really excited to have her with us today as we get to be some of the first people to hear about results from the RLDP project. So thanks for coming here today.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. So lovely to be here with you all. I'm gonna probably do over here a lot because a lot of you decided to be on that side of the room. I'm just gonna get this started here. So as you see, today I'm talking about multiracial church head clergy in the United States. How many of you have seen The Matrix? That's right, you're my people. I love the Matrix movies, especially the first Matrix. Besides the visual effects and great action sequences, it is the storyline that is really intriguing. The entire Matrix movie is a metaphor for waking up to reality, coming to see our world for what really is, choosing to understand our context rather than passively going along about our day-to-day. So what I really love is that the lesson of the movie is that while learning the truth of our context can be difficult, it is in fact really the only path to real freedom and change. Another message of the movie is grasping the truth of our context, what life really is, can be a game changer for us and for those we are in relationship with. It can change how we go about being in the world, how we understand ourselves, and we can gain a greater sense of what we can control and what we cannot control. And there's another reason I like The Matrix, and it's because it's about how society organizes our lives in ways we usually don't think about. We sociologists put a lot of emphasis on how the world around us, our social context, including the groups, communities, organizations, societies we are a part of, affect people, how we think, how we believe, even how we feel. So in our view, understanding human life greatly depends upon understanding our social world. C. Wright Mills, you may have heard of him, he's a well-known sociologist and theorist, came up with a concept called the sociological imagination. And it gets at this. What Mills argued is that everyone needs to have a sociological imagination. That is, an awareness of the connection between personal experiences and social conditions. Often people look to themselves and what's going on in their lives to try to understand what's going on in their life. They believe that the main reason their life is the way it is, their families, their work, their friendships, and both the joys and challenges associated with these has to do with their personal experiences. Mills highlights that our personal experiences or troubles, he calls them, are often not very personal at all. They are the result of broader social conditions that are out of our control. We begin to grasp this when we see that other people like us, who may seem to have quite different immediate circumstances from us, in fact have quite similar life experiences and outcomes. In another life, I used to be an engineer, and I began to gain a bit of a sociological imagination for the first time when I was still an engineering student. I was sitting in the front of class like I normally did. Class had yet to begun, and for some reason that day, I noticed a demographic pattern. I turned around and I saw that very few women were in the class. And this is a class of about 50 people. I also noticed that there were only a couple African Americans, and it struck me. Why were there so few women in my engineering courses? I didn't have the answer. But truthfully, that question and other epiphanies like that are ultimately what took me down toward the road of sociology. Interestingly, that first epiphany happened during a third-year engineering course. The point being, I had been an engineering student for some time and hadn't seen what was right in front of me. In this lecture today, I'll be talking about the joys and challenges of engaging in multiracial church ministry through the experiences of multiracial church pastors. And I will encourage you this afternoon to see that broader social conditions have a profound impact on the day-to-day lives of multiracial church pastors. To understand the broader context of the multiracial church pastor, we have to first understand what is the role of the multiracial church pastor. This is actually the guiding question of the research project, the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project. Now, before we talk about the multiracial church pastor role, let's first take a step back and discuss what is a role generally. Well, a role, simply put, is a set of expectations. These expectations come from a variety of sources, from the person who's fulfilling the role, the people associated with the person fulfilling the role, and even the people who may not be connected to the person fulfilling this role, but that care about how it's done. These last people might be a part of an identity group that the group person is a part of, and they may be directly or indirectly connected to them. The reason roles are so important is they are the basis of our everyday interactions with people. We live out our lives based upon assumptions that people are going to do what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. And we do this every day, all day. Many of you are students. If you treat other students like a professor rather than a fellow student, it can throw that student-to-student relationship out of whack. If you try to boss around your boss, that can throw that relationship out of whack. If you're looking for your dentist to clean your teeth and instead they whip out a humidifier for your face and begin to give you a facial, right? That'll throw that relationship out of whack. We go about our days all day, every day, depending on people doing what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. We take this for granted. In other words, we expect people to fulfill the expectations of their role, given the context they are in. So let's look at the multiracial church pastoring context, remembering that roles are sets of expectations. First, we have the head clergy, they have ideas about what the expectations ought to be with that role. We also know that pastors have connections with congregants, and congregants care about what their pastors do. They have expectations about that. The religious community that the pastor is embedded in also has expectations about what that pastor is supposed to do. We also know that there are macro level factors that matter as well. So in this case, we're going to talk about how religion works in America. That impacts what the pastor will do and feels they can do, and the expectations tied to being a pastor. And finally, I will emphasize race. Now, there are other macro-level stratification and status systems that matter, but because the study, the RLDP, focuses on multiracial church pastors, I emphasize race. These contexts are intentionally represented as concentric circles because the outer ones impact the inner ones. And also, just like with the matrix, one can go deeper and deeper into understanding their context. One can choose to go deeper, in this case, farther and farther out from their immediate surroundings to understand the context of the multiracial church pastor. It's kind of like understanding those various layers of the matrix. We usually pay attention to the context that we can see, that we can interact with daily. In this example here, that would be a multiracial church's congregation and religious community. But I'm going to focus on what they don't see necessarily. That is race and religion and how it works. So let's first talk about race. It is important to note that race and ethnicity are not synonymous. They are related and overlap in that in the U.S. context, and they can reinforce one another, but they are different, and they have different implications for people's lives. And so let me clarify. What am I talking about when we say ethnicity? First of all, an ethnicity is linked to a group. And an ethnic group is a group of people that sees itself, or they see themselves, as sharing a variety of things. These include a common ancestry, a collective experience. This is often something negative. Or having come from the same part of the world. Ethnic groups use culture, that is, particular ways of believing, thinking, and doing, to make it clear to themselves and others who they are, to foster a sense of connection, and to develop a sense of a we. Race is when meaning is given to what people look like. The characteristics we pay special attention to are arbitrary, and they're just a few: phenotype, hair texture, skin color. And the process of race works something like this. We look at a person, we take a subconscious and immediate mental inventory of his or her physical attributes. We then put these attributes together and come up with a conclusion about the person's race. This in and of itself, if we just pause and we think about it, is quite astounding. We've come to believe that we can look at the tens, the hundreds, the perhaps thousands of people we see every day on TV, internet, face-to-face, and categorize them into 2, 3, 4, 5 groups of people based upon just a few physical characteristics. This is really quite bizarre if you pause and you think about it. But this is the thing, the process doesn't stop there. It's this next step that's really critical. The whole point of squeezing people into racial categories in the first place is so we can assess something about them. Race isn't about who we really are. That is what we actually believe, think, do, can do, feel. It is about what others, the dominant group, conclude you believe, think, do, or can do based solely upon what you look like. Race is about assigning worthiness based upon physical characteristics. America is a racialized society, which means race governs practically every area of people's lives, and consequently, even though the laws, policies that explicitly stated what racial groups were and were not worthy of certain privileges in American society, freedom, citizenship, land ownership, quality education, better jobs, better places to live, the list can go on, these are no longer on the books. It's still pervasively around. We see it everywhere, the inequality and the lack of justice. So, just to briefly recap, Race and ethnicity differ in very important ways. Where ethnicity is about giving meaning to culture, race is about giving meaning to physical characteristics. Where ethnicity is about using culture to establish a group identity and a sense of a we, race is about establishing other people's worth and capacities. The other broader social context I want to highlight is how religion works in America. In America, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We commonly refer to this as simply the separation of church and state. The consequence of this is that religion in America is completely voluntary. On the one hand, this means that a group can practice whatever religion they want, how they want to practice it. But it also means that religious organizations and their leaders cannot rely on government support or endorsement. They sink or swim on their own. They have to work to get the resources they need to stay afloat, and religious organizations and their leaders, in some senses, are kind of competing for resources. That includes congregants and money. Religion, in a way, kind of mimics what's called a marketplace. Commonly, religious organizations do religion in ways that attract particular demographic groups, homogeneous unit principle, something like that, right? We might call that market niches. Some churches are structured to appeal to the traditional crowd, others the hipster crowd, others to a certain racial and ethnic group, and so on. As I mentioned, my discussion today is based upon data from the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project. This is a multi-year study funded by a $500,000 grant from the Lilly Endowment. Thank you, Lilly. I had over 20 people on my research team, including, well, actually, it's more like 30, including undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty. But the core members of my team are here, and super grateful to have worked and continue to work with these wonderful people. You have 3 graduate students, actually a couple of them are former graduate students. One is a pastor from Multiracial Church, and a couple of them are my colleagues. One is Rebecca Kim, and the other is Kirsten Bate-Priest. I intentionally created a diverse team for the RLTB. I believe this is important for at least several reasons. If you can do it, I encourage you to do so. With a diverse team, you gain a diverse pool of cultural capital. Possessing appropriate cultural capital is critical for building connection. Culture allows that bridge to occur, and if you have a diverse team, that brings different knowledge banks of cultural capital to the team from which people can draw. Also, having sufficient knowledge about appropriate cultural capital matters because it allows us to treat others with respect and care. Knowing people's culture and how they engage with and understand their social worlds brings us closer to their humanity and getting to truly know them as human beings. Another benefit of a diverse team is that it brings together multiple standpoints. A standpoint is rooted in one's structurally determined social location within the social world. It's the result of structures that constrain our agency in some cases and expand our agency in others. Our standpoints make it so we are included and welcomed in certain circles and excluded from others. The totality of these experiences, these identities, these statuses is what produces our standpoint. If you want to know more about that, see Patricia Hill Collins. She talks a good deal about our standpoint. The RLDP. The RLDP is a multi-method study. It was executed in 2 stages. The first phase included conducting the face-to-face interviews with head clergy of multiracial churches. We went to 12 cities across the country, and these are represented in the 4 census regions. Online survey data was also done by participating pastors or a staff person, and it got a lot of different information about the congregation. A lot of it was demographic, but it had to do with their mission statements as well as the resources that were available to them, and so on. We also conducted interviews with 9 denominational leaders to get a sense of the broader religious context that these pastors are a part of. Then we went back in the second phase to learn a little bit about the congregants. And in this case, we went back to several pastors' churches to talk to people who are part of the churches of the people in the study. And this included congregants from a variety of different racial and ethnic compositions of the churches. We wanted to understand their social attitudes, their religious beliefs and experiences, characteristics, composition of friendship networks, and so on. And we also sent out an online survey where people can fill out as well. Today, I'm actually going to just focus on the pastors' interviews. Now, these are actually the core of the study. The interviews with the pastors are the core of the study. The other work that I did was more to triangulate the data, but also to talk about and get at some of that context that they experience. What are they embedded in? So, this is the deal. It doesn't matter what the racial or ethnic composition of their church may be. There is a very wide breadth of expectations that comes with being a pastor or a priest. These include reaching out to the community. They have to teach. Now I have to pause here for just a minute because it wasn't until I began to study pastors that I've been going to church almost my entire life. I kind of was like, gimme, take care of me, pastor me, until I really engaged in their experiences. And I thought, wow, they have to come up with something like amazing every week to say to inspire people. That's kind of nutty when you begin to think about it, but they do. But on top of that, they reach out to the community. They're also responsible for church growth. They're also responsible for generating income, managing employees and staff, managing congregant expectations. I say all this to say, right, they got a ton of stuff to do. So here are just what a couple pastors in the study have to say. This description is from a white priest who had just retired a couple months prior to the interview. He had headed either a predominantly Asian or Asian white parishes across his career, and he had this to say. When we were in seminary, we were taught theology, scripture, etc. We were never taught how to be a CEO or a CFO or an HR person or a builder, all of this. And then you just get thrust into it. You have to be the fundraiser. You have to manage the money. You're in charge of everything. Therefore, you're responsible for all the employees and everything. And so we see here that being a priest included a whole lot more than giving sermons or homilies, performing religious ceremonies and sacraments. Seminaries just didn't properly prepare them for all the other things that they were expected to do. This is an African-American Methodist pastor, and he had this to say about the expectations of congregants. Every church has its own culture, and churches are looking for certain things in a pastor, a certain leadership style, right? If a pastor is very outgoing and the church doesn't want the pastor to be outgoing because they want to make the decisions, there's going to be a clash, right? Sometimes what the church may be looking for, the last pastor didn't have. So they want the next pastor to have that. So embedded in that, you see that the expectations of the pastor are very much connected to the congregants. And in fact, in some cases, they may not be there anymore if they don't listen to the congregants. The bottom line is all head clergy wear many hats: teacher, preacher, counselor, comforter, human resources manager, financial manager, strategic planner, and so on and so on. However, the pastors of racially and ethnically diverse churches have a lot of other matters to deal with in addition to these. And here are just a few general patterns that emerge in our analysis of the interviews of the multiracial church pastors. These factors really exacerbate any of those tensions I just talked about that pastors generally have to deal with. Worship is an issue. What we do in worship really matters to people, and the real issue is who gets to decide what you do, how you do it, when you do it. This matters for people, and power struggles and dynamics emerge around worship and worship services. Polity matters. And this is simply how the religious denomination is structured. The Episcopal polity, pastors are appointed by the denomination. Multiracial church pastors in denominations with an Episcopal polity are, according to the pastors, often thought of as being diversity specialists. They can be appointed to dying churches that generally are not doing a good job adjusting to the demographic realities of their surroundings. Denomination supports these pastors, or they want to see them succeed, because really the job of the pastor is to increase attendance and the finances for the church. And they're very explicit about this. And the denomination sees diversity as the way to do this. So these Episcopal churches, remember, they are tied to the land. They have a lot of land and buildings there. They don't want to lose that. So they hire people, put people in place to keep that. Congregational churches hire their pastors. So congregants can literally fire their pastors or simply fire them by leaving the church. Demographic resources matter. Churches have to respond to changing racial demographics of the neighborhoods they are in. Resources matter. Multiracial church pastors express a lack of social support, financial support, among many other types of resources that they need to do their work well. Race matters. It affects pastors' leadership. It affects how they experience that leadership. It affects their access to the relatively limited resources that are already available to pastors to do the kind of work they have been charged to do or they have chosen to do. Now, I just gave you a broad overview of the themes that emerged in the data. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to focus on the stories of 3 pastors, and this will provide a more holistic view of who the people are who fill this role of the multiracial church pastor and how they experience this role. What I want to highlight here is their biography and how the social context they are embedded in affects them. I remind you that this social context includes their congregation, their religious network or denomination, their race, and religious system. Does the impact of the social context always jump out at us? No, sometimes it's clear, other times it's more subtle, yet by listening to their stories, we learn more about what it means to be a multiracial church pastor in the U.S. and what it is aims to play the role of a leader in an organization that is trying to be a racially and ethnically diverse community. So, let me introduce you to Pastor Daryl Chung. Pastor Chung is an Asian American pastor who heads a church in the northeast of the United States. He started his church with the aim of it being racially and ethnically diverse church. That is, he planted the church. The congregation is affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, and it's mainly white and Asian. The modal attendee is a college-educated millennial. Pastor Chung struck me as a very confident person. He's easy, he's comfortable with himself and what he believes. He's open and honest about himself, his church, and his challenges. And I found him easy to connect with. But given his confidence, and from what I read as a strong leader, it was actually quite surprising to me to hear him share some of his vulnerabilities later in the interview. Pastor Chung shares how he had to navigate the broader religious environment as he started his church, revealing how the U.S. religious system works. As he speaks to groups about what he is doing, in part with the hope of getting support, financial support, they just didn't seem to get it. And he says, I always talk about the fact that in the beginning, people would ask, what's our focus group? And they're saying, who are you going to try to reach with that whole idea of the homogeneous unit principle? You've got to be more effective to grow. I would love to tell people we totally bucked that and that we were different, but it was true. We really grew slowly. I didn't know if we were going to make it or not because of the fact that it was too general, too diverse. Starting a church would be hard regardless of whether it was aiming to be diverse or not. But starting a diverse church just didn't seem to compute to people who he needed to support it. Despite starting the church to be a racially diverse church, he says that being a multicultural community isn't a part of his vision. It is to be biblical rather than growth, which is what a church actually needs to keep going, right? That they see is biblical. And he says this, I would never say our vision is to be a multicultural community because I just personally don't believe that would be good. I think for us, we hold the Bible as our ultimate standard. And again, not for us to grow bigger, because if that's our goal, we're probably not going to be successful. His experience growing slowly and the work he has had to do to get buy-in from possible financial supporters have perhaps changed how he understands being a multiracial church pastor. It couldn't be about growth. It had to be about being biblical. But of course, in reality, growth is what keeps the lights on. The structure of religion in America makes it hard to keep the doors open with more and more people coming, given not only in their human efforts, but in their money. He then talks about how he tries to deal with potential conflicts. It's not easy. You realize how different people are. You realize how challenging it is. Things that a homogeneous culture would never have, like communications or disagreements about. Like in a multicultural sense, you're having to tread carefully at times. So the context at the time is Ferguson. Ferguson, as you know, I'm thinking you may know, but I'll tell you anyway, is a reference to the killing of an unarmed young black male teen, Michael Brown, in Ferguson, Missouri, by a white police officer. The officer shot 12 rounds at Brown, hitting him 6 times, and this killing, as you know, sparked the Black Lives Matter movement after Trayvon Martin. So he says this, we use Ferguson, for instance. In a homogeneous culture, whether black or white, this can be a real rallying, unifying thing, for whichever perspective. But in a diverse church, you're thinking, man, how is this person going to take it? How are they going to take it? And you know what? You say, you're going to offend someone most likely, so it's really hard. What strikes me about Pastor Chung is this sense, though, that even though he started this thing, he never quite felt like it was his home. There would be times when it would be a real struggle to feel like, man, am I even in the right? I know I'm leading this, but I think I can do a much more effective job somewhere else among people who are just, again, much more, at least, racially similar to me. And here's what happened in the past few months that's proven that true. There's been a sense at our church, especially with a lot of the Asian influx, I've been feeling much more comfortable in our church. And then he goes on to say this. And a lot of it's been tied to my background. I didn't see that at first, but I have a lot of shame just based on who I was. So here we see, as I talked about, he's a very strong person. That's how I perceived him. And in many ways, being vulnerable is being strong, if we listen to Brene Brown, which I don't know if you... Okay, but he is really vulnerable about even why he thinks he decided to do this multiracial church thing, which at least in part was not so much about doing the righteous thing. So, the difference between guilt and shame, guilt is kind of what you've done is wrong, shame is who I am is wrong. And that sense of, I didn't realize how deep I had a sense of being Asian was an inferiority. Like it was something I had to dig out from. And even doing church, even doing a diverse church, I realized I liked being a part of a diverse church because it makes me feel more significant. It makes me feel I'm doing something different then. And I'm looking for all these ways to try to be special, try to take away my shame of what I feel is deficient in me, and just having to come to grips with, no, those are not deficiencies. That's the way God is made. But deep in my psychosis was this feeling of who I am is less. So Pastor Chung opens up about how he struggles with feeling inferior as Asian. In fact, he decided to head a diverse church as opposed presumably to an Asian congregation because it was somehow better and gave him greater status. He is open about what it means to be a racially subordinated human. Now, we might want to point to Pastor Chung and say, oh, he just has a problem. But what you must understand is that his emotions and sense of self is a response to a broader macro-level context of race that indeed does subordinate Asians, indeed people of color generally, under Anglos. So we see that Pastor Chung faces the questions from his religious network about the practicality and efficacy of heading a diverse church. The church is not growing, and that means less resources, human and financial. As a congregational church, he cannot rely on a denomination for support. We also see that he finds himself walking on eggshells at times, knowing that ideas and attitudes about some subjects are highly racialized and have real meaning for people in his congregation. Then we see how race and racial affinity matter for Pastor Chung personally. He recognizes that he feels most at home with other Asians and is introspective about how being a part of a racially subordinated group affects his sense of self. All of these factors together may contribute to the emotional stress that he shares. The next person I will introduce you to is Pastor Dennis Mills. Pastor Dennis Mills is an African-American pastor of a Methodist church on the West Coast. Pastor Dennis Mills has been heading diverse churches that have been majority white and then Asian. Some have black in them, some have white. Pastor Mills is on his third church as a head pastor with the denomination at the time of this interview. All of them have been diverse, and he regularly speaks on issues of diversity within his denomination at a national level, and he even wrote a dissertation on the topic. Similar to Pastor Chung, Pastor Mills talks about missing being around people like him. He says, I miss worshiping in the black tradition. There's something about the black tradition, the singing, the spirit, the movement, and I miss that. Every other year, I go to a convocation of pastors of black churches. My soul is set on fire, and I get fed. And I come back, and I'm ready to go. I'm just rejuvenated. Still, he really values the diverse church. But it is more at an intellectual and maybe a faith level than it is at an affective level. He says this, there is something that I like about being in a multicultural church because I believe that heaven is not going to be segregated. And so the Lord's Prayer is really big for me. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. And so how we are living as if we were in heaven. And so that means living together and living to understand one another, to accept one another, to affirm each other's gifts, to use all of those gifts for ministry. But then he talks about the challenge of not quite having a home. Despite growing up in the black church, after heading diverse churches, he became alienated, he felt, from black pastors and black church members. Yet, he was not fully accepted by whites either. And he says, and so I realized when I started pastoring my first church, I was in the in-between. There were black folks, some black pastors, black church members that seemed like they had an issue because I was in a white church. Oh, he's making more money. He thinks he's all that. But the white church didn't see me as white. They saw me as black. So I didn't fit in. He was less connected to an ethno-racial community once he left the black church. And this speaks to the overwhelming racial homogeneity of American Christianity. But then he talks about how this made him feel, right, personally, the reality of being in the in-between, that it can be quite lonely. It can be lonely, and it's in those times, Jesus went to the mountaintop, Jesus went to the garden, he went on the other side of the lake, right, to get his batteries recharged. So for me, going to the convocation of black pastors, that is like me going to the mountain and getting recharged. What I find interesting here is Pastor Mills doesn't go to a place for multiracial church pastors to refuel, to be reconnected. He goes to a place for black pastors, nearly all of whom had black churches. And this speaks to a sense of belonging that he desperately needs for his own spiritual and emotional health. He doesn't go to conferences and spaces about diversity, but those are not the places where he feels he can get his batteries recharged. Over time, though, Pastor Mills has adapted some to being in a church that is mostly white, or at least has a large proportion of whites in them. He still has the sense that white people there that he's leading may be racist, and he describes experiences that, from my perspective, look like microaggressions. That is, subtle social interactions that communicate and reinforce his subordinate racial status. He had this to say in the interview, now, I feel uncomfortable with being in the white church. I understand some of these, which is interesting because he was in a diverse church, but he called it a white church. I understand some of these expectations about leadership style, differences around preaching, differences around visitation, what it means to do outreach. So I was comfortable navigating that, It does get tiring. Sometimes you just think, is this racist or is this just ignorance? Pastor Mills is committed to issues of social justice and diversity. Pastor Mills had a good deal to say in the interview. Diversity in the church was important to him. The interview was among the longest. It was about 2 hours. And even after the interview, Pastor Mills wanted to still talk. He walked me to my car and then continued conversations with me in the parking lot. He tells me, whites do not want to change. They're concerned about Asians changing the church. They want to go back to the church when it had 300 white kids. They have to recognize that whites have left and the community's changing. Despite becoming more accustomed to heading congregations with whites, in his experience, whites in the church were not particularly interested in relinquishing resources, that is power, to support Asians in his church. The last story I want to share with you is that of Father Mercer. Father Mercer is Irish Catholic. He has been actually a priest or in the process of becoming a priest since he was an adolescent. You see that he is heading a congregation, actually 2 parishes in the Northeast. One that I was talking to him about was a 3rd African American, a 3rd Anglo, and a 3rd Black immigrant. It was an LGBTQ affirming parish. The people that went to the church were about middle-aged to seniors on average, with some families, and the attendance, as you see, was about 475 people. He started actually in predominantly African-American churches or past parishes, and then later in his ministry was assigned to a diverse parish, actually 2 parishes, as I mentioned. Father Mercer's training in a Catholic seminary, though, did not by any means train him to be a priest of a Black congregation, which is, as I said, what he led before heading this racially and ethnically diverse parish. But not to worry, one of the parishioners let him know what he needed to do to improve. He says this, basically from the seminary, I was taught to preach like 7 to 10 minutes to a white congregation. So when I got to the Black congregation, I thought, now what am I doing? A lady said to me one Sunday, we guess you don't like to preach too much, do you? I said, why? She said, we're used to having somebody preach the word, teach the word, and bring it home. And I said, really? I said, what's that mean? I said, my interpretation was you want me to preach longer? She goes, no, I don't care how long you preach, just preach it, teach it, and bring it home. Father Mercer learned that he needed to preach it, but he still was not sure exactly what that meant given his Irish Catholic upbringing and his training. And so he says this, well, I didn't know what that meant, so there was a Baptist minister who was teaching at the seminary over here. He had a night school, and he was teaching a course called Preaching and Ministry in the Black Churches, so I signed up for the course. He goes on to say, so it was a much different learning, but I had to learn how to do that. So I learned how to do that, and I've enjoyed that, and it helps me to come out of myself more and help the congregation more understand the word. So when I came here with a mixed congregation of white and African-American immigrant, I'm thinking, oh, Lord, now what do I have to learn? Do I have to do that all over again and learn different stuff? But I just probably temper the style somewhat. So here we have a few things. Being a pastor of a church of people who are different from you requires supplemental training that is outside a leader's normal circles. Father Mercer had to be intentional about getting the information and the resources he needed to lead this congregation because he did not learn it in his seminary. That's a structural issue about your religious community. What he learned while leading an African-American church, the cross-cultural skills, were to a degree transferable and prepared him at least for a congregation with Anglos, African-Americans, and Black immigrants. We also hear the extra energy and maybe even a bit of exasperation that comes with heading a multiracial church. Now, when he moved to the multiracial congregation with whites, it is here in this context with race mixed with nationalism and Americanism emerges. Now, we did have years ago, when we started the gospel choir in the fall. In the first Black History Month in February, the gospel choir was singing. This is a great story. This lady got up and said, our closing song today is going to be Lift Up Your Voice and Sing the Black National Anthem. Lift every voice. This guy gets up and he walks up to the podium. He was a World War II commander, big rough guy and everything. And he grabs the microphone. He goes, wait a minute. There's only one national anthem. What's this Black national anthem stuff? Well, the choir, years ago, would have been a big scuffle. But the choir just kept singing, lift every voice and sing, the words in heaven ring. And he's going, I don't believe this. What's going on there? Da 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 da. Okay, is anybody going to stop this? Da 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 da. They're just singing in the background. And he's going through this rant. And his wife walked out of the church because she was so embarrassed by her husband doing this. And he just got tired of saying something. He came back and he sat down. The choir finished the song. And what did you do? Well, I was already walking out of the church when he started. And I turned around and I saw, so I just let it be. I didn't try to run up and stop it or anything because the choir was singing and he was ranting, and I'm thinking, this is an unbelievable scene. They just were going on with the singing while this guy. So when it was over, I looked at the choir and I said, you okay? Okay, what do you mean? I looked at you and Jack was, oh, that's Jack. You know the way Jack is. He's just, and they just kind of dismissed it and said, what's the big deal? What I think more than anything is this demonstrates that Father Mercer had by this time developed an environment where people of color felt comfortable standing up against whites and standing up for themselves. They were given the power in this context to express their ethno-racial culture. And remember, ethnicity is critical for people's sense of community, and Father Mercer affirmed that in them. Another area where race, whiteness in particular, showed up was in white flight. As Father Mercer explains, and at each stage, as that change is happening from white to African American to immigrant, there were always people that left, you know? There were white people that left when the blacks moved in, and there were some of the people left when immigrants moved in because they just assumed everybody was illegal. And they didn't want us to get in trouble, you know, so those kind of people didn't hang around. So they have this immigration center there at the parish, and he says this, because they asked me, are all these people illegal? Oh, yeah, all these people are undocumented. I said, well, not all of them. Oh, you mean some of them are? Yeah, some of them are. Well, that's why they're here, to get their things straightened out. They've come for the immigration center. People said to me, one lady said to me, so somebody comes to your office and they're undocumented. Yeah, so why don't you call the police? I said, well, because we're a church. We're trying to get people back on track and get their status adjusted and stuff. But they're illegal. And I said, well, yeah, but I mean, they came here and they want to start a life. And we can help them do that. We're church, by the way. We're not the police. But some people just couldn't understand that. Whites left when blacks came, and whites left when immigrants came. Some congregants were quite unsure how to deal with congregants and attendees who were pejoratively called the illegals. And by using language illegals, they are drawing a clear line between who they see as in and those who are out in the church, but also in and out of their country. So Father Mercer had to make a choice to stand in the face of very direct confrontation that was quite racially charged from more powerful congregants. In this, he had to have developed a clear sense of who he was, what he believed, and what he valued. That was what some of his congregants expected of him. And we see that those expectations varied in very divergent ways depending on the race of the congregants. And he had to make a choice. And that choice meant someone or some group would be disappointed. No way to get around it. Father Mercer had been a priest for decades. He knew who he was and what he believed in. But he is also at an advantage structurally speaking. There are not enough priests. And from interviews with priests, it seems that most priests do not envy those who have been assigned to congregations that are poorer or urban or primarily made up of people of color or that are diverse. So in many ways, this protects Father Mercer. Right? What is the bishop going to do? Move him? Father Mercer never says this, but the reality is he's already heading 2 parishes in the city. They're not going to challenge him, and he knows it. Something else that is interesting about Father Mercer is he never expresses not feeling at home, though. And this is in part because of the Catholic theology. Priests we gather from this study have a strong sense that their goal is to serve their particular churches. But he also lives in a society that regularly affirms him. Pastor Mills and Pastor Chung are now in environments where it is diverse and majority white. They no longer have that one space, religion, where they can just be with people who are like them. Father Mercer is not reliant on the church for this need. Most other spaces he spends time in, such as his religious network, his peer groups, and so on, are largely white. Some concluding thoughts. Pastor Chung, Pastor Mills, and Father Mercer's stories reflect core themes that ran through our interviews with multiracial church pastors across the country. Our analysis has shown us, to put it frankly, that multiracial church pastors have a whole lot on their plates. And as a result, they experience a considerable amount of what sociologists call role strain. And this strain can be rather intense. So what is role strain? Role strain happens when a person is unable to meet the expectations associated with a role, and when the person experiences psychological stress as a result. Now, William Good, who put forth this theory, argues that role strain is inevitable, and that regardless of the role, people will experience some degree of role strain. But the real issue is how much role strain will they experience. Regarding multiracial church pastors, this is the rub. While all pastors in the American context experience role strain due to all the very different responsibilities I've had, which I talked about earlier, what our analysis shows us is multiracial church pastors experience considerable role strain, the kind that can make it difficult for priests and pastors and other types of clergy to do all the tasks set before them. But then it can strain them in profound ways psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, and these strains are a direct result of trying to build a religious community of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Now, I want to return to those two broad social contexts that affect the pastoral role, the U.S. racial system and the separation of church and state, in hopes of opening up your sociological imagination a bit. These two characteristics of American society, which are out of the head clergy's control, work against the very thing multiracial church pastors are trying to do: build cross-racial religious community. In fact, the U.S. racial system and the separation of church and state actually promote religious racial homogeneity. The separation of church and state creates a voluntary religious environment such that people can go to whatever church they want to. And because race is a key status in America that guides who people spend time with, who they want to spend time with, they choose to spend time with people of their same race. Also, since religion is protected from the direct influence of the government and the indirect influence of the broader dominant society, religion in the United States is the one institution in the country where people of color can experience a modicum of freedom and power. In many ways, religion has functioned as the safest space available to people of color in the United States, where they can create community, affirm their racial and ethnic standpoint, reproduce their views about the social world, and generally think, feel, and behave how they want, when they want, without any hindrance. When people of color attend diverse churches or diverse spaces of any kind, they are giving up a whole lot. They're giving up a whole lot more than white people, and this includes head clergy. So together, the U.S. racial system and the separation of church and state encourage and support churches that are primarily made up of people from one racial group, not diverse ones. So it should come as no surprise that less than, it's actually now 20% of churches are racially diverse. Yet, at the same time that we have a racial system and a religious system working against diversity, society says it values racial and ethnic diversity. Diversity is all the rage, not just here in the U.S., but globally. You review the literature on diversity. There are studies that have been done in and by scholars from India, Australia, Canada, Britain, even Slovenia. Whether we're talking about the workplace, educational systems, or religion, leaders are central to making sure diversity happens. This stated value is in direct conflict with how the U.S. racial system and the U.S. religious system works. And it is this very strange social space where multiracial church pastors and any leader who is committed to or put in charge of fostering racially just and equitable spaces find themselves. Returning to seeing the head clergy person as a role, I would say that multiracial church pastors have no script for understanding how to do diversity. All they know is they're expected to make it happen. But nothing or very little in society actually supports this endeavor. There is limited social infrastructure that pastors can rely on. Think about Pastor Mills. There's no clear established theology or education that is taught that supports and affirms this in seminaries. We think about Father Mercer. There are no clear avenues for material support. Think about Pastor Chung. Not many congregants, especially white congregants, are invested enough to make the sacrifices to make cross-racial religious community work. Put another way, an unscripted role is a role without clear established standards or a script, and that is not supported by established social structures. So what do multiracial church pastors and others charged with making diversity and justice happen, what do they do? Well, first, we must gain a sociological imagination. The only way to really understand and navigate our social world is to first understand how it really works, and then and only then can we affect it. I also read somewhere, I don't know about you, that the truth will set you free. But freedom doesn't necessarily mean easier, just free. And I think maybe that could mean free to effect change. Neo, Morpheus, or Trinity couldn't become who they were. Really, they couldn't make a real difference until they chose to swallow the right colored pill, learn the truth of the world they were living in, and accept their responsibility of freedom. I suppose what I am saying is neither can multiracial church pastors or any of us, for that matter. Hey, even if you don't, figuratively speaking, learn to stop bullets, fly, or be able to do karate kicks midair, I still would love to do that. Perhaps you will come to understand how to dodge a few bullets along the way. Once you have gained an awareness of the connection between personal experience and a broader social context, then you will come to have a better understanding of how to do this kind of work, or in a case of multiracial church pastors, ministry. And so what you would need to do then is know what you believe and why. Father Mercer knew what he believed and why. You must have a sense of what you can control and what you can't control. You must learn to take care of yourself. When you're going against structures that are powerful and strong, have historically rooted, that's really challenging and can be quite painful, and you need to take care of yourself in the process. And I encourage you, if you are doing this work or if you are aiming to be a multiracial church pastor or a part of a diverse church, build community with others like you. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I've got a microphone. I'll come around and find you if you've got a question, so we can all hear. Do people mind?
Thank you so much for that talk. I'm curious, in this idea of it being an unscripted role, have you found in your research any examples of ways that that role is being scripted? Like you mentioned that this Black pastor had gone to conferences with other Black pastors, not places where you're with other multiracial church pastors. Are there places where multiracial church pastors do gather and do find community within that are being developed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so they are finding, they do have places where they go in, they meet, that's for sure. But the thing about scripts is that scripts have to be affirmed by the others that you're interacting with. That's what Goffman talks about. When I go back to the idea of roles, roles are affirmed by the other people that you're interacting with. So yes, they do get together and they talk about what it means, but those aren't the people that they're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Those are sort of huddles for maybe once a year, and you can take those scripts back, but are the people that you're interacting with and doing life with and doing community with, are they legitimizing those scripts? Are they saying, oh, we don't like that? And so it's not, scripts are always embedded in broader structures as well and need that reinforcement, but really good question. Yeah.
I've got a basic question. How are you defining multiracial for your research?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we do in the literature, people have started before me, they just have this 80-20 cutoff where there's no group that's larger than 80% of the congregation. And so the idea behind that is that once you get past that, or once a group gets past 20%, then there's kind of a tipping point, so to speak, and they can begin to impact the space. But that's kind of the cutoff, and almost all of our churches are over that. We have a handful that weren't. We did our best to minimize that, but most of them do meet or exceed that cutoff. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about, you mentioned that people see diversity as a really positive thing, and one thing I've been wondering myself actually is what people think. Has anybody studied why people think diversity is positive? Because sometimes I get a sense that people like diversity because they think it's almost like a charity, like you're helping other people out into this field or area, and we need to help the other lesser people out. And that feels very demeaning to me, rather than realizing that all of the voices together contribute something that a bunch of people saying the same thing doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So what I would say is this. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book Racial Formation. It talks something called racial projects. And basically it's just ways in which we go about reproducing how race works, how we understand race, how we deal with the redistribution of resources, and what meaning is surrounding that. Okay, I would argue that diversity and inclusion and what has happened really emerging sort of with the end or the demise of affirmative action is a racial project that is doing in some ways what I suppose you are suggesting, which is not dealing with the real issue, which is the real issue is equitable distribution of resources and power across racial lines and lines of other groups and statuses. So I believe that there continues to be this broader narrative about diversity, yet we're not really talking about what that is actually doing. And I'll give a plug for one of my graduate students. She's doing a study right now called Cost of Diversity, looking at that even more in depth across different contexts. So I think it's a really great question. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Did you do any studies on multiracial congregations that didn't have whites as a part of it, and what are some findings from that?
It's a really great question. Yeah, so so just to make sure I'm clear, I want to be specific about the level of analysis. So the level of analysis is the pastor, but we do have pastors in the study who head congregations that are like what Ray talked about. So there are some churches in the study that are under pastors in the church that are not mainly white or have a small proportion of whites. And those tended to be churches that were Catholic parishes. They're ones that have gone through transitions from being either white immigrants, so let's say where they were Polish, and then African Americans moved into the neighborhood, and it transitioned to African American, and then we're catching them as they're moving through another transition as Latino Catholics move into around the area. And actually what we're finding, which is kind of interesting about this, because one thing I didn't do for the study, and what I'm learning, is that paying attention to the immigrant experience and story is really, really important. Now, the study wasn't organized around that. We're catching it, but there needs to be a study that actually focuses on that and asks very specific questions around that. And so what I'm finding is that this sort of American identity that people have, so if you're a second or third generation or more, then there can be sort of this us versus them that can emerge in a congregation about those who are been here longer, who are American across race, and those who are first generation. So that emerged. That's one thing that we're hearing in some of the focus group data. And then also another thing we're finding is that this can be some real tension between groups of color because remember, religion becomes a space where groups of color really use to reinforce their sense of self. So those homogenous spaces are spaces that are safe spaces. And so when they become diverse with another group, even another group of color, there's a sense of we're losing that space. This is all we have. So that seems to be there as well. And then also there's some issues of real racism and discrimination that has emerged. So we've heard some groups are prejudiced against others. There's one pastor in particular, a priest, really trying to navigate a parish that was African American and Latino. He had such intense conflicts there, and the conflicts had to do about the change in the church, but also some of the Latinos were very, very racist against African Americans, and African Americans are feeling displaced, so there was a lot of tension there. So these are just some of the things that emerged, but the study wasn't about that, so I can only talk about that sort of briefly. Yeah, but really good question.
I'm going to ask about another thing that the study wasn't about, but I'm sure came up in various ways, and that's the question of class and how class and education showed up as the leadership especially was thinking about trying to engage these projects, and were they able to create class diversity, or did they find themselves working within these sort of homogenous class contexts that then could have sort of some racial diversity within it?
Yeah, right. So that's a really good question. So in some ways, what I just talked about the Americans and the immigrants also was intersecting with class. And so what happened in some cases, you're going to see the people ended up having the lay leadership power, or the people who had the higher level of education and class status. Now, priests were more actively aiming to combat that. I did not hear that as much in congregation, conservative Protestant, or what you would call evangelical churches. I didn't hear that as much in mainline churches, but it was there. It was there. Priests aimed to do it, but it's still a tension. So it's confounded a bit with being American and being a first-generation immigrant. Those are overlapping with class. Yeah, that's a good point.
Did the size of the congregation change the experience for the pastor? I would think like a smaller congregation might welcome people because it would increase their power in numbers, or?
I know, right? Not like that. I would say the big cutoff in the experiences of the pastors had a lot to do with when you're really getting to kind of the mega churches. So the mega church pastors are in some ways, as you can imagine, a little bit of a group of their own already as megachurch pastors. And so they would have a bit of a gap or a distance between them and their congregants. They wouldn't necessarily feel those kinds of challenges in the way that the church pastors of smaller churches did. But yeah, you would think that people might be like, really desperate, but that's not what religion, we have to remember what religion is doing. It's a really important space for people to build connection. So people are there to connect with people they want to connect with. That's why people go to church or go to whatever religious organization you're attending. So it's not necessarily, this is the thing on other ones, let's put it this way, another pastor, other ones, get into a position where they're just willing to close the doors. If it's just like, no, we'll just close the doors, or we'll just move. We'll literally move the church. That's what conservative Protestant churches will do, because they can do that because they can move. Mainline and a Catholic are connected to land in a building. Conservative Protestants can do, they don't have to, but they aren't in that way because of their polity. They can get up and go. And so an option is to just leave the community and try to grow by going to a place where you think you can attract people. So yeah, one would think that people, but that's not what drives people. But anyway, that's not very human in the sense that it's being social people, being social, that we're really about connection, right? And building community. So that's what people are also looking for in religious spaces. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Time maybe for one more question.
I have 1.5 questions.
All right.
Did you talk to any women?
Yes.
Okay, and then how did women you spoke with experience role strain at the intersection of then gender, race, and class?
Oh, boy. Okay, so, first I'll tell you a story about one woman pastor that I interviewed. And let me just say this. I've been studying pastors for a good deal now. I changed my research agenda to study pastors. And it's sometimes I just find myself in interviews where my heart is just breaking. And so some cases, not all for women, I'll tell you how this manifests for her. She actually had a very well-resourced church that she was heading. And, but the dynamics of the male interactions were extremely hard on her emotionally. And I think in part because she did actually have, I would suggest, because she did have a well-resourced church. She was appointed to a church that was well-resourced. But most of the people in the church, the women in the study, they're all head clergy. So because they're head clergy off the bat, you can probably guess that some traditions weren't represented, Catholic and conservative Protestants, because conservative Protestants often do not appoint women or hire women to be their head clergy. They may be the co-pastor, but they're not the main clergy. So they were, all the women in the study were heading mainline churches. Another trend that we found is that they tended to be appointed to these smaller, struggling churches. So they were given these not so resourced churches, with a couple exceptions. They were heading small churches. But another thing that came up is that they really seemed to understand issues of justice and equality in a way that some of their male counterparts did not. And I think that has to do with their standpoint as women, and their standpoint as women in a field that's largely dominated by men. That's what I would argue. So yeah, that's something. And it was really hard to get women in. I mean, we worked very hard to find women head clergy, and we have some that we can say a little bit about. Yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Edwards again.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And thank you for coming.